for free markets in order to stem the intellectual climate that is currently pervasive in the American government.
And let's go, I want to go to Richard first and then Joel. Richard, you've been writing a series of columns in the Washington Times, which ought to be published in the Washington Post, by the way. They're that good. They need, or the New York Times, they need broader, everybody needs to read Richard Rahn's columns, and you ought to make sure you come out like once or twice a week with the column. And he's been making the case for a return to classical free market economics. Austerity actually does work, and you have examples of this. But are you fighting against a wall? Is it impossible to make a breakthrough here? Or are we going to see an adoption of the classical model, or return to the classical model, or are we just stuck with Keynesian economics and its ill effects?
Our problem is the empirical evidence is on our side. You can get my columns on cato.org. In fact, there's a lot of really good stuff on there, even if you don't care for my views. I did a column, it was published Tuesday, on attacking Paul Krugman, who came up with this ridiculous thing about how we need to have more government spending. And I just looked at the countries around the world had spent more. In fact, my colleague, Lotta Moberg, who teaches at George Mason, and you will be hearing from her tomorrow, and I had looked at the countries around the world in terms of having sustainable fiscal policy. And by that, we meant where the debt GDP ratios were less than 50%, where they weren't really adding to deficits in this way that would increase that debt GDP ratio, and where they're basically following a sustainable fiscal course. It was really pessimistic when we looked at it, because in Europe, we left out the petro-states and the very poorest countries, so in Europe, a place like Norway was left out. But the only European countries which are really on a sustainable course are Switzerland and Sweden, her home country. Germany, so-so. Bulgaria and Estonia have very low debt to GDP ratios. But then if you look at Asia, it's really only Australia and South Korea that are in good shape. In the Americas, Chile is in very good shape. Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Canada, sort of so-so.
Venezuela, disaster.
Yeah. But I mean, for the most part, the world is in a terrible problem with this huge growth of debt. And I kidded before about disagreeing a little bit with John Allison about how long this is going to take. And John and I have had this discussion. But I was just making a list of triggers it could set off the great inflation, the next great inflation we talked about this morning, which would cause interest rates to soar. And at that point, all is over.
So that's your prediction, that we're headed in that way, that direction?
Well, I think most of us would say at some point, given all the money out there, and given these continuing deficits, it's obvious the Obama administration has no interest at all in reducing spending. They're doing everything they can to offset it. But just think of things that could go wrong. I hope John is right. And John and I both agree that we would like him to be right and for me to be wrong. But just think a few of the things that could go wrong. One, some kind of military crisis in the Persian Gulf that shuts down oil for a bit. Where the Fed suddenly announces, for whatever reason, they're moving off quantitative easing, even though I'm in favor of it, but that would cause a spike in interest rates, and that could get out of hand because we know the Fed is very poor at forecasting the results of its own policies. Took China and Japan. There have disputes about some islands. This seems to be minor. But things like this, we know from history, can get out of hand. A terrorist attack on a U.S. port, which, let's say is some radioactive substance. The policy people in Washington panic and shut down the ports and for some period of time, and you could see chaos coming out of this. There's big articles about the student loan default, how that's a big bubble, and that could explode. And suddenly the government come in for a bailout on the student loans. And I forgot what the number is. Joel probably knows. It's fantastic, some in the hundreds of billions. Another housing bubble. David Stockman's been talking a lot about that. That's coming along. Yesterday, the Wall
I
Street
think
Journal.
we're pretty far away from a housing bubble.
Well, with any one of these, you can say the probability is low. The question is, with all of them, is that when you add up all the various things that could go wrong. Yesterday, there was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about the new currency war that has already started, where everybody's engaged in competitive devaluation, even though we got floating rates, but these policies. And we know from history, these things can get out of hand, and that could cause a big inflation. Fraud in the numbers. Somebody had mentioned that earlier. The IMF did a good thing, and we're always teasing Warren here about with the IMF, but they did a very good thing. They sanctioned Chile for putting out phony inflation numbers. Argentina, excuse me. Chile is a good one. Argentina for putting out phony inflation numbers. So a couple days ago, the Argentine government put price controls on virtually all consumer goods. We just know that Argentina is headed for one or another. Every 20 years they default. They're about ready to again. And finally, with the Obama administration pushing big tax increases. And this could set off another rise in interest rates and a panic. That's just some of them. The rest of you can come up with others, but
this really demonstrates the importance of leadership, though. If President Obama had said, listen, we're just going to extend the Bush tax cuts another 2 years or even make them permanent, would it have passed? Would the Democrats have supported that? Yes, they would have. So leadership is so important, especially when you're with the majority party. And it can be for positive or negative depending on the president's understanding of sound economics, and he really lacks that in a lot of ways. Now, I'd like to ask Joel Stern, who teaches at 6 universities all around the world, and you forgot to mention the University of Singapore, which I understand you teach at there as well. So you have a global perspective as well. And so tell me, are we winning the battle of ideas in the academic world at all? Are we winning the battle in the business world? In the world of government, where do you see things? The Economic Freedom Index suggests that we haven't really lost that much, but tell us your perspective.
Well, from a personal standpoint, let me say this. First, a negative comment about China. My firm had offices in Shanghai and Beijing. I've shut them down. We left. How come? It's impossible to do business in a country that does not respect my intellectual capital. I started working with a very large chemical company. We went to visit another company. And I found my materials in the hands of the CEO. I said, how'd you get this? My friend at the chemical company sent it over to me. Oh, really? So I asked my people to come back and go and visit the chemical company. And I said to the CEO, you gave us this check to deposit as a deposit on the assignment? I'm giving it back to you. I don't want to work with you. I don't want to work with anybody here who does that. I have that problem.
But couldn't that happen in any country?
No, it's different. One of the most interesting things, one of my students asked me at Carnegie Mellon, where we have 80% of our students are from Asia. My preferred place to invest is in India. The British did bad things to the Indians, we all know that. But the one great benefit they left behind was a judicial system in which contracts mean something. Somebody tries to pull a trick like that on me, and I sue them, they're going to lose in court. The man was laughing at me in China. I didn't find that very pleasant at all. I don't find it funny. So that's a very big aspect to me. Incidentally.
Hey, Joel, but what about Hong Kong? Because they do have a better legal system.
Well, they do, but you see, we don't know when they can just change the rules on you.
Okay.
Another thing I'd like to just say in this meeting is that many of the issues that we have talked about in prior years and this year has to do with Obama policies that have run amok. There's no question. The things that the Obama administration has been doing has kept the economic growth rate at most at between 2 and 2.5%. The average has actually been closer to 1.8. What do we need? Well, by this time in the economic recovery, we're supposed to be growing at about 4%. And incidentally, the rule in macroeconomics is the faster you fall, the faster you come out. The slower you fall, the slower you come out. If you don't believe it, take a look at the 2001 recession that George Bush had. We didn't even know we were in a recession until it was almost over. And then it took us 3 years to get back to normal growth rates after that.
There's a couple of charts on that, yeah.
But here's my point. If Obama did not follow the highly regulatory issues that he's thrown at business, and if he had a more predictable tax structure for us, I believe the growth rate in the U.S. right now would be over 4% a year. If we were growing at 4%, there would be no budget deficit to worry about. The tax revenues would be coming in so rapidly, people wouldn't be consistently worried about the size of government spending. They should be, but they wouldn't be because the budget deficit would be fast disappearing.
Now, Joel, I think this is a point that we could dispute a little bit. Just because the government gets more revenue does not necessarily mean that you would get government spending under control, because, okay, you get more revenue, but maybe they will take that money and spend it and we'll still have the deficits. Why would you think that there's any limit? Why can't we go back to the Bill Clinton era where that actually happened? And you have a good point.
I want to add one more part to your question for Joel. The problem is the entitlement spending. It's not discretionary spending. And the sequester, that'll hit discretionary spending, which is all to the good. But the entitlement spending, which is driven by the huge new entitlements on medical care and, of course, demographics. And even with a surge of revenue, which I agree with, you would get with 4%, it's still not going to cover that.
Well, one more thing, let me just say.
Okay.
In fairness, the level of government spending is being compared to our GDP. Our GDP is an income number. It's not an asset number. In theory, what they should be doing is taking the level of debt and comparing it to the market value of our assets. We could get rid of that debt almost overnight by simply auctioning off all kinds of assets, property and land all in the West. You can't believe what it's worth at current value terms. Our debt ratio is not high at all. At all. And yet all of this yak about it, it's enough to drive anybody crazy. On a different subject, however. When my friend Warren was talking about the Berlin Wall coming down, he could just as easily have been talking about China. That was one of the great things that happened. Deng Xiaoping was the leader of China in the 80s, in particular I'm thinking of, and he met with my other teacher of great renown, a man named Merton Miller. You might know him as the team Miller and Modigliani. Miller won the Nobel Prize in 1992 for his work in financial economics. But in the mid-1980s, he was going to China 6-7 times a year, and the rest of us couldn't understand why. There was always a joke about him because he loved to drink the beer of local countries. And he'd say, China's a big country. It takes me a while to get around to all the beers. Okay? That's what he said. But it was curious because suddenly China decided to adopt his recommendations. You think Milton Friedman is a free marketeer? You haven't seen anything until you talk to Merton Miller. So Miller actually is the one who convinced Deng Xiaoping to relent and permit market forces to operate, but on an experimental basis around Shanghai and maybe 400 or 500 miles around that whole area. And when he saw what happened to the economy, he said, okay, we'll permit that to happen. When I turned to Milton Friedman and I said to him, Milton, what do you think about that? He said, well, remember my book, Capitalism and Freedom? What did I tell you in that book? The most important thing is economic freedom, not political freedom. Political freedom will come later. Yeah. Without question, they will get the right to vote.
Now, Nick, just very quickly, you've had a little bit of China bashing here in terms of intellectual property rights, which I think is an issue. Does China have an entitlement problem unfunded liability problem with a huge welfare state as we do in the United States, or is that not an issue in China?
China, and I don't think it's an issue in China because the welfare and the healthcare stuff like that, under the administration of Jiang Zemin, who was the previous chairman of China, we actually reduced a lot of the Maoist and Dengist welfares in China. So China doesn't have like too much welfare. Most people rely on incomes and pensions, and they don't have.
And then the
too
other
much
issue
entitlement.
on
Yes.
intellectual property rights: can businesses depend on the rule of law in China, in your opinion? Joel doesn't think so. What do you think?
So you're talking about can we implement, say, European law in China in terms of business European Western law in China? It's possible, but China is a huge country, and it has over 1 million private firms, in China. So, and each firm is different, but I believe it's totally possible to have,
They do have a culture of borrowing ideas, if you will, and not paying. I've written a number of books, and on all my books have been, well, a lot of my books, 4 or 5 of them, have been translated into Chinese.
Okay.
And lately I have actually gotten I got an advance when they were translated, but no royalties after that. And I've been told my books are selling like hotcakes, but in China, but I haven't seen any royalties on it. So I think
Sorry about that.
How's
is
that
an
any
issue.
different from U.S. book publishers?
Yeah, that's the same in the United States in that respect. Warren, do you have a comment? Then we're going to turn to Latin America.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on China. China may have a bit the opposite problem of excessive entitlements. They have virtually no safety net, and it would be desirable in terms of a balanced relationship with the rest of the world if the Chinese consumed more and saved a bit less, thereby relying less on having to export in order to keep the economy going.
Well, and
Wait
in
a minute.
fact,
Wait a second.
Joel?
Warren,
Yes.
do you believe that markets don't work? What's happening with you? We'll have to take your degree back at the University of Chicago.
Well, he worked for the IMF for 30 years, and
No. Markets work within the environment they're given to work within, and that's what I'm saying about China. The Chinese, for very rational, self-protective reasons, save an enormous amount because their government provides no safety net.
Oh, good. And so, instead of us trying to encourage Americans to save more, maybe we should make them more self-reliant. We might actually learn something from the Chinese.
yeah, here. I agree. I think that's a
It's
good
all
idea.
it's all balanced. We're unbalanced in one direction, they're unbalanced in the other.
I think you are raising an interesting issue, and that is the